So they're going to benefit from this discussion because Social Innovations Journal subscribers are very interested in this notion of what does it mean to be a systems weaver, and especially in this time of COVID, how can you manage your social innovation organizations, especially at a distance, to still have that dynamic quality of being, of fostering social change? So let's start in. Let's see. So just to before I introduce Gail, just a quick review of the context. So this is the second of our 5-part series where we're meeting with leading systems weavers who are going to share with us understanding systems from 2 levels. One of them is how do you run a systems change organization that's structured dynamically and not hierarchically. So what does it mean to have an organization that's informed by the principles of systems, and more importantly, what does it mean to create and sustain an organization like that? So what does systems leadership look like in an organization that's structured with complexity principles at its core? And the second level, of course, is how do you bring about change? How do you bring about transformative change in a system that's broken? So Lynn shared with us how you do that in the domain of wildfire. And today, Gail's going to share with us how do you do that in the domain of energy, of climate change and changing energy systems that are so deeply entrenched that they're very difficult to shift regimes, which is a theme we're going to be spending a lot of the rest of the term on. How do you identify and then shift regimes, entire regimes and paradigms? So let's see. I'm going to introduce Gail briefly. Gail is the strategic director of the REAMP network, which connects more than 130 member organizations to create equitable climate protecting practices in the Midwest. And she holds a master's degree, like you guys will soon, in systems thinking and practice, which I wish you guys also had that option, but well, we have this class. And she founded the REAMP Systems Thinking Academy, which is a systems education program. And maybe she can share a little bit about that with us. And before taking on her job at REAMP, she was a labor organizer at the New Energy Economy Program at the Center on Wisconsin Strategy. Oh, actually, that was the thing she did after she was a labor organizer. Sorry, Gail. So she's had a diversity of experience with dealing with complex situations and diverse communities. So welcome, Gail. So yeah, Gail and I got introduced through a kind of community of systems practitioners that was organized by the Garfield Foundation. And we spent a lot of time together, both in terms of these dialogues over the last year. And we also got to hang out in Santiago, which was quite a kick, at the Transformations Conference, where Gail presented and we held some workshops and sessions. That was kind of fun. Seems like a century ago, right, Gail?
I believe it was just about literally a year ago.
Yeah, it's a different world, but hopefully one will get back to some degree. So Gail, I'd like to start by asking you about REAMP. So REAMP, tell us about the systems change challenge that REAMP is intended to address.
Sure, yeah. So the REAMP network started in 2004, 2005 with the North Star goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, from the electric power sector, by 80% by 2030. And at the time, that seemed like it was a goal that was so audacious, it actually made people angry. They were like, why are you even talking about something that's so impossible? And but now we actually have utilities that have more audacious goals than that. But fortunately, our goal has also become more audacious since then. But anyway, so our goal is now to equitably eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from the Midwest, from all the sectors. So that was the challenge that we originally centered around, was this to eliminate or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% from the power sector.
That is such a huge goal. It seems impossible, really ambitious, shall we say, not impossible. So how, why did you choose a network form to address this incredibly ambitious challenge?
Yeah, and I actually was not part of the initial, this initial process that happened, but the network was started by the Garfield Foundation. Basically, they were really interested in systems change, and they had this theory that systems change would be best served through the process of forming a network. And so essentially, there's a concept called complexity matching, where they're essentially trying to match the complexity of the problem with the complexity of strategies that can emerge from a network. And so this was their theory, was to test. They basically wanted to test and see, could a network be more effective in a complex problem than simply, a series of organizations or a coalition or other ways of people interacting.
Yeah. How do you start a network, or how have you heard about how they started the network, and what was the origin?
Well, so the origin was, I mean, like I said, it was started by a foundation.
Mhm.
So a lot of networks are not started this way, but this particular network was started by the Garfield Foundation. That because they were really interested in this question, and I hope I'm not misspeaking for them, for those who were there at the time, but as I understand it, because they were really interested in this question that I just described, they actually ended up landing on this issue of climate change and the location of the Midwest as a good kind of laboratory for this experiment that they were interested in. And so, yeah, the way they started actually was they reached out to a dozen or 2 dozen organizations. There were between 20 and 30 people who were part of the initial process, and it was a systems mapping process that lasted about a year, that these people really fully engaged in, and they tried to map the power sector as they understood it at the time. And from that mapping process, they landed on 4 strategic levers that they believed would focus on the way the system was behaving and changing system behavior. And this is, as I'm sure you may have already covered, this is a really key concept in systems thinking, that while we recognize outcomes are important, in order to actually change a system, you have to change the behavior of the system, not just the outputs of the system.
Yeah, change the behavior, not the outputs. And so the process identified these key leverage points.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And the leverage points were, can you name a few of
Sure.
them?
Yeah. So there were actually 4
Mhm.
leverage points. And again, this was all just focused, this was based on their understanding at the time of just the power sector. So basically, at the time, there was a lot of energy on the solution end of things. So trying to get a lot more wind power onto the system. And one of the key insights through the systems mapping was, you can put all the wind power in the world up on the system, but at the same time, there were all these coal plants. There were hundreds of coal plants that were slated to be built. And if we didn't stop those coal plants, it wouldn't matter. It was going to be curtains for the climate, no matter how much wind you put on. So it was this recognition that in addition to increasing clean energy, you actually had to stop the fossil fuel energy. So those were 2 of the key levers, and then the other 2 were to increase energy efficiency, and also then I believe the 4th one was to then wind down existing coal plants. So there were kind of 2 things going up and 2 things going down.
Cool. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you entered into the scene and what role you took on and what role you play.
So I initially was actually just a member of this network. I was working for the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, or COWS. And so I think COWS was not one of the founding members, but came on very shortly after this systems mapping was done. So a lot of people found this really inspiring, and it really kind of changed the way funding was happening in the Midwest and the way advocacy was happening in the Midwest, and really created a lot more impetus both on energy efficiency and especially, again, on these coal fights. So I was a member. I was part of a member organization, and then there was a position opened called Learning and Progress Analyst that I ended up taking with the network itself, and learned very quickly that one of the things about networks is that they're really confusing. It's not like working in an organization where you're like, oh, I see what my job is, and there's like really clear metrics, and someone will tell me, hey, I'm doing well, or oh, I'm not doing well. It's really not like that. Networks are much more confusing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So, and I guess the systems thinking was sort of baked in, as you mentioned. There was this
Yeah.
initial mapping exercise. What else could you say about the role of systems thinking and the sort of the design and the management of the network?
Well, so the good news is all of you are kind of in this, you've got a lot of advantages that we didn't have as a network when we were starting out. So there were not so many tools for systems thinking, and also just the technology wasn't as good. And so it was, there's certain tools, I don't know if you guys have played around with Kumu at all, or these other tools that make, make systems mapping, makes it easier to do drafts, to share, to all kinds of things. So I would say the role of systems mapping as distinct from systems thinking, I want to kind of make a distinction there. So there was this systems mapping process um, that was maybe a bit of a double-edged sword. People found it inspiring, and it was really useful. And it became stale very quickly because as our understanding grew, we saw shortcomings in our analysis, and the world changed around us, and it took a year of people's time to do it. And so you had this problem where even though people were very proud of what they had done and were very proud to be part of this systems informed analysis, they were never going to go through that year-long process again. Like, just absolutely not. And so it was really hard to figure out how to make it a living analysis.
Yeah, and was that accomplished to make it a living analysis?
We're working on it. Yeah, so one of the things, this was actually one of the reasons that I started the Systems Thinking Academy was we had this tradition of, our motto as a network is think systemically, act collaboratively. And again, like I said, people were really proud of being part of this systems-based network. But over time, I think we understood less and less what we meant by being a systems-informed network. And so I decided to start the Systems Thinking Academy with the idea of helping people become systems thinkers for, for, for just their everyday life. And so I wanted to get away from this idea that systems thinking was only about having the technical expertise to do these causal loop diagrammings or stock and flow diagrams or whatever, these different kind of technical tools. And I wanted people to be able to see that systems thinking is actually just a, a way of trying to understand strategy and intervene in the midst of complexity. And I wanted to give people robust tools that were really durable, that they could take and into all kinds of situations, and just develop the mindsets associated with systems thinking and some tools associated with systems thinking, um, and and have that become part of the culture of our network, as opposed to thinking, oh, systems thinking is something that these experts do and it takes a year and it's really hard.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned earlier that equity had become a sort of an emergent theme that wasn't necessarily there at the beginning. Did that? Would you say that was a result of a kind of systems thinking process?
Well, so I I think that at the beginning, at the original systems mapping, although we talked about climate change as a complex problem, I think in truth, in retrospect, we really mapped it as a very complicated problem as opposed to a complex problem. Um, and so what I mean by that is, it was really hard to figure out what was going on, but you actually could kind of, you could get there. And you could see, okay, A leads to B, and then B sets off this whole chain of other things, but we can see what the chain of other things is. And in truth, what we've come to understand, thanks to many environmental justice activists who, you know, helped us see this, we came to understand that climate change is not fundamentally a technical problem at all. It's fundamentally a social and political problem. Now, again, hopefully to all of you, this seems perfectly obvious. I don't know, but this was not an obvious. This was not an obvious thing at the time that we kind of had this revelation. And I think this is actually one of the things I have found often in systems thinking is that once you have a revelation, it's super obvious. So, I mean, like, it's super obvious, right? Like, you can't just increase wind, you have to fight coal. Like, you would think a 2-year-old could tell you that. But, no, that's not the way it was working. And again, like, it's super obvious that climate change is not purely a function. Like, we if it were purely a technical problem, we would be, we would have been well on the way to solving the problem in 1985, right? So, I mean, it's perfectly obvious it's not purely a technical problem, and instead it's a social and political problem with very important technical aspects. But again, this was not kind of the idea that was in good currency at the time that we were having this understanding.
Yeah, I see. There's a question from Daniela that extends this conversation. Who was left out of the original scope? And yeah,
Yeah, well, I can tell you who was in, which was really good people who were mainly older white men with advanced degrees. So,
is that a problem?
yeah. So, and it's not to disparage any of those folks. I mean, like I said, I think, they did a great job within the parameters of the problem as they then understood it. And thankfully, our understanding has evolved.
Yeah. And so how did you find out that these other folks were not part of the conversation?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, how did I find out? Was that your question?
Yeah. Did they make their exclusion known, or was it just a realization that they needed to be included in order to actually address the problem? Like, what did that light bulb look like when it was turned on?
Well, I mean, I think definitely, frontline communities of color, this is not like yes, they've been making it known. Now the question is, I think probably a good question is at what point did, you know, did we sort of connect what was being said with what we were trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's a really good question, sort of how that exactly came to be. And I mean, I really just have to give a lot of credit to environmental justice activists who are willing to kind of take us to school on a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a big part of it. But I think, also at some point in our network, it may have been, I'm not exactly sure, but at some point in our network, in the environmental community, when I first came to the environmental community, I would say I found it a place where it was challenging to talk about values, which was kind of strange. So coming from the labor movement, everything was kind of value based, right? Like there's this value of solidarity, whatever. Like, but coming to the environmental movement, everything was kind of strangely divorced. Like it was as if you could talk about technology and as if you could talk about science without talking about without like having a heart behind it. And so I think at some point that was just changing. And I think I haven't tried to go back and sort of explore, I guess, the origin story of all of this changing, but it's been a wonderful change that people now talk about, what's right and wrong in moral terms and not just scientific or practical terms.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to talking about sort of network weaving and network leadership, in the sense that maybe we associate systems thinking with kind of an engineering mindset where it's not really about people or values or it's more about the system-wide technical dimension. So how did paying attention to the individual in your network, how did you interpret that, or how did it become a network practice?
Well, maybe I'll back up a little bit and say why I think it's a systems practice
Yeah,
to think about the individual. And so maybe I'll just share a little bit about my philosophy on systems change.
please.
So have you talked as a class already about hard systems and soft systems?
Briefly.
Okay. Maybe I'll just quickly recap. So
Yeah, please do.
yeah, so basically, like in the history of systems thinkers, there was sort of a long tradition of thinking about systems as if they were actual things. So, like, as if you could say there is a transportation system or a power system, um, and that you could then sort of map these things using causal loop diagramming or stock and flow diagrams or these other techniques where you were mapping a real world thing. Now, at some point, some of the thinkers began to realize that this was fundamentally flawed because I'll share with you all the definition of a system that I like to use, which is it's a collection of entities seen by someone as interacting to do something. So I'll just say that again. It's a collection of entities seen by someone as interacting to do something. The reason I like that definition is because it talks about that these things are set in motion, they're interacting to do something, but it's seen by someone. So we might all be looking at a car and we might see different things. One person might see a system that is designed to get you to the store. Another person might see a system that's designed to that whose output is your hobby. It gives you pleasure, or maybe it's to help you find a date or whatever it may be. So the entities interacting to do something contained within that car, it depends on who's seeing it, what that thing is designed to do. It could be something that's creating bills for you primarily. So anyway, I just think that this is a really key point, that when we're doing causal loop diagramming or these other things, what we kind of have to do is we have to sort of treat it as if treat the system that we're mapping as if it's a real world thing, but we have to hold in our minds that it actually isn't. All we're doing is mapping our mental models. So when we're talking about our mental models, like they come from us, they come from our background, they come from our ambition, they come from all of these things. No two of us are going to see a system in the same way, even when we think we're talking about the same system. So a system does not really exist. So I'm sorry if that's all a little bit
No, it's a good
abstract.
fit. It's a good fit.
So anyway, so this is why then we have to really appreciate the people who are viewing the system so that we can have a collaborative effort to talk about the system. And in particular, the number one person that we have to pay attention to is ourselves, because we're bringing all of our biases. We're bringing our ambition on what we want to do, what our career trajectory is. We're bringing all of our baggage from, how we were raised and stuff that's happening with our pets. Like everything is like, we can't help it. We're viewing everything. So the best thing that we can do is to bring self-awareness to our systems practice.
Yeah. One of the themes that came up in the section on love and discord that folks read today was this idea of appreciating the whole person. And I think that seems to relate to what you just said. As a systems leader, as a network leader, how did appreciating the whole person inform your practice?
Yeah, and I like to use this word appreciate in all senses of the word. So it's good if you can actually appreciate someone as in like them, but that doesn't always happen. But what you can really strive to do is appreciate in the sense of the word of really seeing them, not discounting them, accepting their validity, even if you don't accept the validity of their point of view, but that they have a validity as a person. So anyway, so I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder, does anything come to mind, like a way to concretize that? Like, what does that look like in practice? Can you think of an example or an anecdote?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think can be I'm trying to think of a good anecdote, but like when I'm facilitating something where we're trying to see, I'll give a good example actually. So one exercise we did at one session was there's often kind of some tension among different advocates because some people are out there, just fighting all of this terrible stuff that happens in the world, right? They're trying to stop the pipelines from going through indigenous land, or trying to stop the big CAFO from coming to their neighborhood. Um, Other people are out there like trying to reform the existing system and just, like try to tweak things, make it better. And other people are just like, hey, we need a whole new system, right? Or still other people are like, you know what we really need? We just need to love each other, man. Like, and so you can see like there's these tensions, right? Where it's like it's really easy if you're someone who's out there putting your body on the line to think that those people who are working on reform are just like kind of selling out. Or like if you're working on reform and that's how you see success happening, it's really easy to look at these people who all they do is fight the bad stuff and say, well, what's your solution? How come you just say no? When are you going to say yes? Or, all of these different mindsets, right, that we're bringing to our work. But the truth is, to find the systemic solutions, we actually need all of those things. We need the people to, fight the coal. We need the people to say yes to the wind. We need the people actually to change how we are in relation to each other. And we need people to think big and build new systems. And that you're not, reform alone is never going to create systemic change. But if you don't have a reform element to your systemic program, you're just missing. It's tied into everything. And so anyway, so one of the exercises that we do sometimes is called the 4 R's, where we look at these 4 elements of systemic change, and we get people to sort of divide up into like what are the things that they love to do. And some people say, oh, I love fighting stuff. Other people are like, you know what, I really enjoy reform, or whatever it may be. And then we get them to ask questions of each other and to just ask those hard questions. Well, how come, if you're just fighting all the time, how come, when are you ever going to say yes? And they ask these tough questions of each other, and they make that space, and they really like, and then the people hearing the questions think, that's a good question, and they give their best answers. And it's real. I've really seen how that's shifted people and allowed them then to work together in new ways. And by the way, I'll just credit, I learned this idea of the 4 R's from a group called Spirit in Action.
Spirit in Action. Cool. I'll check it out. As leaders, as systems leaders, it's a curious term because we talk about the idea of emergence and self-organization as systems properties. And so systems kind of defy leadership in the formal sense. And this idea came up during our discussions about leading from behind. And when the time comes, let go of control, which doesn't sound like a leadership trait. But nonetheless, it seemed to be something that a lot of the systems weavers cited. Does that resonate with you, this idea of leading from behind and letting go of control? And how did that show up in your leadership in the network?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely kind of what we do. It's really all about trying to empower people to co-create the strategies together. So to create that space where they can appreciate each other, where they can think systemically, and where they are actually able to create emergent strategies. So it's not about so in a coalition, normally what you have is, you have an idea, you have a goal, and then you get people together and they think really smart things and they work really hard to achieve the goal. Whereas in a network, it's much more emergent than that. And so if the type of leadership that is, hey, let's get everyone to do this thing, that's really for a different type of problem and a different type of solution. So in a network, it really is about helping people co-create strategy. That's actually kind of the point of it, or at least the point of how our network functions. And it can be pretty hard to let go, but I think one thing that helps is if you work on your own self-awareness of what your own biases are, first of all, and really see people for what they are, then it helps you not shut down ideas that are emerging that seem kind of stupid or something, and just allow those ideas to emerge, trust the collective, and encourage that discussion to come forward.
Yeah, co-creation. I guess that sounds like a very time-consuming process. How do you
Yeah.
manage something like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just it's ongoing. It's like it's kind of the whole point, really. So, I mean, sometimes we have very intentional spaces
Hmm.
where it's like, hey, everyone, we just want to be clear that in this space we're co-creating strategy, but we're actually always trying to do that in everything we do. So even if we have a webinar, we are trying to engage people, to help them think about like ask them to share their questions that will help move the conversation forward. I mean, that's a practice that everybody does, right? It's not just a network practice, but that's actually a systemic practice, is that, that co-create, just to build it into everything we do. There's actually there's two main things that we try to build into every single thing we do. One is connecting people and the other is co-creating strategy. So, like I said, sometimes that co-creation of strategy is like super intentional. There's like the whole agenda is planned around it. Other times it's more like we're just setting the table. So it's like, okay, let's get out the cups and the forks and everything. And, we'll see if something emerges here. But
Yeah. Danielle has got an interesting question about, sort of we want to do this emergent process, but we live in a world of linear thinking. And often our funders or our board members or, other folks in our system are expecting us to implement strategy based on the plan. How do you manage that tension?
yeah, well, first of all, there's this great quote by Donald Schoen that I really like. He basically talks about that if to be a systems thinker is to like go into the swamp. Like there's sort of a high ground where that's where solutions are, like right, like there's technical solutions. It's also where like the prestige is, but like the really messy solutions are in the swamp. And at some point, you kind of just have to decide, you know, am I going for credit here or am I going for the swamp? And so it is challenging because unfortunately our society is in such a way that, like, right, like the funders like things that are not nearly so messy as a general rule, and understandably so, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if when I'm paying my power bill, I don't want someone to say, yeah, we've got this thing and power is kind of going to get to you, like I'm just like, no, if I'm paying my bill, I want it to come. But anyway, so I think it's a real challenge, but I do, I do think that, oh, there's so much I want to say on this topic. Actually, I'm not sure how far to, how far to go into it. I feel like I could talk for an hour just on this topic alone. It's very rich.
Yeah,
Um,
go for it.
so, um, right. So kind of everything is set up to reward the the linear process, the we checked that box process, the here's the nice neat outcome process. I do think that causal loop diagramming is a useful tool to kind of bridge that, because causal loop diagramming can only depict something that's two-dimensional. And it is actually, I mean, it is actually quite linear. It's linear, but with cycles in it. And so it's kind of like, it is a way to take some of that complexity and tell the complex story in a way that can concretely show some intervention points. Um, but I think one of the big problems with causal loop diagramming is that it is technical, and in my experience, it's just not a great tool for really engaging a diverse group of folks. There are a few people who like, they just get it. They're like, oh, I understand how this works. You put the plus here and there's this like balancing loop, and and other people just don't get it. It has nothing to do with people's education levels. It has to do with how their minds work. Some people just get it and some people don't. And so that makes it really a challenging tool to use. But anyway, I do think it can be
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, I hear you. I see a question in chat from Kevin about, so you mentioned coalitions. It sounds, and networks have this cost and you need to sort of co-create, and there's lots of working collaboratively. What's the value added of a network? What can a network do that a coalition can't?
Yeah, what a network does is it evolves over time. So I mentioned at the beginning that that Garfield's idea was kind of had to do with this like kind of concept of complexity matching. So there's like a whole theory behind this, um, but a network, it builds, it has these relationships that evolve over time to create emergent strategy. So, I mean, one great example is if our coalition, if we had been a coalition focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% from the power sector by 2030, I don't think we would have ever come to these different understandings. We would have had really good strategies for doing those things, but what we wouldn't have necessarily done is built relationships, built structures that could be nimble and change over time. And so I guess maybe the best, most simple way to put it is that the difference between a coalition and a network is coalitions are kind of operate on kind of a top-down model, even if they're not necessarily structured top-down, it's sort of conceptually top-down, whereas networks are kind of more conceptually flat. I won't say bottom up because up and down are not really the same. Like there's aren't really concepts in networks. It's more sort of conceptually flat. I also think too, though, that too much can be made of parsing the difference between networks and coalitions because lots of coalitions actually really are like super, like they have a super healthy network component, and lots of places that call themselves networks are actually just coalitions. So I don't want to like parse it too fine.
Yeah, there's all sorts of hybrids, and it's not a clear distinction. I hear you. What an interesting question came up in chat about from Mike about what happens when you can't build empathy, or what happens when there's differences that can't be bridged. And that kind of gets at a theme we talked about in our discussion with the other system weavers about how do you engage different kinds of diversity to produce a productive friction as opposed to just agreement.
Yeah.
So how does that land with you?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question because I'm a huge fan of dissidents. So I always like to sow the seeds of discord in our network because I just think it's really healthy for people to be able to disagree. And I think you know, it's partly why it's so important to build trusting relationships is that you need to be able, in a network, people can vote with their feet. And so if you find that the tide of the network is just like turning against your opinion, if you don't have those relationships with people, you may just say, forget it. And then that network becomes too homogenous in their thinking. So having said that, I think the question was specifically is what if it's too far? What if there, can you say again what the question was? Like, it was something to do with like, what if somebody is just sort of too far outside the.
Yeah, I think it kind of gets at the question of disruptors, people who are actively disruptive or not in agreement in the network. Do you try to kind of push them out the door? What would you do with what's your experience with disruptive people or disruptive ideas inside the network?
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So in general, I like them. But, you know, there's obviously disruption that can happen in more positive ways or more negative ways. And, some of it is cultural. Like if, a lot of us in the upper Midwest, we're not super combative people, and it doesn't take a lot for us to be kind of startled by if somebody's just a bit brusque or something. Which we wouldn't last 2 days probably in a network based in New York, right? So some of that is just kind of cultural, which can show up in much more insidious ways, right? When you think about like, there's all kinds of studies that show that, when people of color talk, people assume that they've been talking a lot longer than they really have, or in particular, like when Black men talk, it's kind of assumed like Black men often have to like really calm their voice down so that other people who aren't Black men aren't perceiving them as being really threatening and so forth. So there's all kinds of insidious ways that we can interpret something as disruption, again, because we don't have self-awareness about what's happening in our own assumptions. But I would say in general, though, there are some people in our network who definitely like have very, very minority opinions on certain things, on certain types of technologies that are acceptable. And I think you just kind of have to hold that and trust that things will evolve over time. I mean, we've been very fortunate that we had what was kind of a tiny minority of people who really, you know, were in our network and willing to just keep being that gadfly, saying, look, it's not about the technology, it's about capitalism. And those people were laughed at for a long time, but I mean, not really laughed at because again, we're from the upper Midwest, but so, but uh, but fortunately enough of them kind of stuck around and kept saying it, and they were getting enough value out of the network that it was worth it for them to stick around. But I think those people really have to be cultivated and honored. And It's really incumbent on, like, if you're a facilitator in a room, to really watch your own body language and honor those people. And if someone is a disruptor in the sense of like that they will suck all the oxygen out of the room, you also that can't be accepted either, though.
That's bad disruption. Yeah. So there's almost a kind of a good disruption. There's this idea in complexity thinking that there's a kind of edge of chaos where things are most generative, and that certain kinds of tension or friction or actually enable a higher degree of productivity or higher degree of innovation. Do you experience that? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can go back and forth because I think in a network, you need enough like-minded thinking that you can actually feel safe to express yourself and to actually work productively with others. But if you have too much of that, then it's just an echo chamber and it's kind of nauseating, right? So
Yeah.
I would say we have definitely found that edge is super important to monitor. Like, so for example, we have a structure where we're spread across 8 states, but each state kind of has like a little mini reamp within it. But in that sort of state-based structure, that's where there's a lot of people who they don't really necessarily see themselves in the climate movement, but because they're working on similar things in that state, like those relationships are built and new ideas come, and there's kind of that porousness that's really it just is so healthy for our network.
Yeah, I hear you. We're in the year of crises, right? 2020. So many on top of one another. How is that landed in the network, and how have you found that it's possible to maintain the energy and maintain the commitment during a time when people are so distracted and so upset, and there's so many things pulling them away from your long-term strategic plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I hope that we're doing a good job at supporting our members in this. Some of the things that we've tried to do are sort of, again, just sort of addressing the whole person. We've just started having once a month break rooms where people just come and have lunch and they just talk about whatever they want to talk about. It might be what they're binge watching on Netflix, or it might be what's happening at the State House. So kind of just like being a space for community. But also one of the things that I did early on was I invited people to a series of small group conversations where they could just get together with 3 or 4 other REAMP members and just say, like, here's what I think this means. Like, I mean, like the energy system, I use that word, loosely, but it's like how utilities are providing power now. It's a very brittle thing. And it's breaking in lots of ways. And so what does that mean? That we're in this moment where it seems like a lot of things could break, in particular because we're going to be because some people that are really invested in those systems are going to be doubling down on them and make them actually more brittle. How can we be sort of trying to operate in this space? And so it was really great. Just people would get together in groups of 3 or 4. And then I tried to synthesize and share back. One of the things that's come out of that is really convening a series of conversations on utility shutoffs, trying trying to promote moratorium on shutoffs and trying to enable debt relief for people that are accumulating utility bills and so forth. So, I mean, again, I don't know how much people want to get into the weeds on some of this stuff, but
A few of them
but that's
do.
just kind of an example of how we've been trying to foster a conversation that's enabled our members to operate in some of the new realities that are happening.
Yeah, I hear you. So I want to ask a rubber hits the road question, especially for this audience, which is, if you want to do this kind of work, what kind of skills does it require and how can you be trained in them? Here are some folks who are in a master's program, pivoting in their careers. How can you prepare yourself for this kind of work?
Well, so for the network type of work, I mean, there's you can be a systems thinker, right, without being part of a network. So I'll just say for the network piece, I think one of the big skills I think would be to just to be able to accept that you're never quite standing in the right place. So, there's too much chaos in the network. We all need to solidify around things. Oh, we're all too solidified. We need to open up our borders and become more porous. Oh, now everything's so chaotic. I mean, you're just never standing in the right place in a network because you're always trying to set things in motion. You're always trying to, sort of scan the horizon, help people engage in strategies that are new. And so it just means you've never checked the box, you've never just done it right. So I think having that skill of just being able to be comfortable in complexity and chaos is probably a good one. And then I think for systems thinking in general, I think I think setting aside some of the concepts of leadership that you were referencing earlier and just accepting that as a systems thinker, you really have to bring a lot of humility to the inquiry, and you have to have a lot of curiosity, I think, because it's not a field for people who come with the right answer. It's a field for people who wonder what the right answers might be.
Yeah. Well, that's a thoughtful moment to end this section of our discussion with. So what I'd like to do now is go into breakouts and have folks reflect on what they heard and see if they have a question or a topic they'd like to bring out. And I don't know what your schedule is looking like, but if you do have time, I could randomly place you in one of these breakouts, which could be fun for you to interact with a smaller group. Do you have time for that?
How long are the breakouts?
Oh, maybe anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes. Not too long.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure.
Okay. All right, let's do that then. So I'll press the magic buttons. And I'll make them 4 to 5 is a good number. All right, I'll see you back here in 5 to 8 minutes. I'll check in, see how you're doing.
Bruce, do you want to keep the live stream going?
Oh, I don't think it'll make a difference. If you'd like to close it, you can.